Corrections and Institutions Committee. It is Thursday, February 6th. This is our morning meeting with the Department of Corrections, which is Isaac, if you want to come up, or are you coming up first or somebody else?
I think we might do it together, but Abby will take the lead.
He's going to take the lead. Okay, so I'm just make sure you introduce yourself to the record and we'll get started. I
sit here?
in the middle. Yes, ma'am.
Got it. And so now I can't see the slides, so I'll hold my computer up. So you can-
Abigail Crocker and Isaac, and then you have Tony online.
We got, Gio, yes.
Okay. Thank you guys for coming.
It's gonna pull up my slides so I stay oriented too. So.
We believe in you.
Get there.
Do you want to introduce yourself, while we're waiting for the slides to get pulled up?
Yes, Anthony Giordano, I'm volunteer coordinator here at Southern State Correctional Facility.
Thanks, Gio.
Okay, so now I'm ready. So I'm Abby Crocker. I'm an associate professor of statistics at the University of Vermont and have had the pleasure to be part of the Prison Research and Innovation Network with the Department of Corrections for the last 5-6 years kind of thing. And really excited to be able to share our background and history and sort of future directions with you all today. So really just wanted to place sort of the plan, the agenda for today, the overview. Just a minute. Go back. There we go. Okay. So the project started in January of 2020. So what we were sort of asked to provide today was background on the project, as well as an overview of some of the highlights from the survey data from our most recent survey, and then updates like where are things headed, where are we now, and where are we planning for moving forward. So we have, I think, an hour here, and I've got 38 slides. So just putting that out there. So ask questions and go, and I'll sort of move along as we need to, but please ask questions.
You actually have a little more than an hour if you need it.
Yep.
Okay,
Hour 15. So
let's go for it. All right. Isaac, can you go to the next one?
Yes.
you'll get better.
Vice Chair, can I turn the heat up a little?
I just did.
Okay. All right, one.
My hands are freezing.
Yeah. There we go. So, so I just shared briefly that we've got background, lessons learned, updates moving forward, but just really want to preface this that in this little over an hour, we're going to touch the tip of the iceberg for all of this. And so the big lesson learned around this is that this has been a very hard and rewarding project. So progress has not been linear, and there's been a lot of highs and lows. And it's those highs and lows that actually make this, I think, such a promising initiative to keep moving forward because we've worked through hard things and had a lot of successes along the way. And just wanted to highlight a few of those sort of big successes really on the top here, noting that when we originally submitted this funding application as a partnership between the Department of Corrections and the University of Vermont, it was at the end of 2019. We got the award from Urban Institute, which funded this pilot initiative across 5 states, and the project was set to launch in January of 2020. When we submitted the application, Commissioner Mike Touchette was the head of Department of Corrections then, and then shortly after we launched the project in 2020, he left his position. And so we've had a lot of turnover in terms of leadership. Right after our kickoff meeting, COVID also came in. So we also dealt with sort of the pandemic as part of this as well. And we've also had staffing changes with actual parts of the team. So I think I might be the only one in this who's actually was part of the original application. So noting that, Gio was there too, but shifting positions. And so really what we've done is move through this project over 5 years with a lot of obstacles thrown at us, but come out with a lot of successes. We recently had our closing meeting for the project down in Southern for this pilot phase of the project down last October. And for those who were there, it was an awesome meeting. So we've had a lot of bad meetings throughout the last 5 years, but this one was really awesome. And I think it really spoke to sort of the potential, keep this momentum going. So to give a bit of the background. We can go, and we can actually go 2 slides. So really back to sort of the reason for this project. So when Urban Institute put out this project, this call for applications over 6 years ago at this point, it was because, prisons, as we know, are really expensive. We incarcerate a lot of people, and despite their scale and impact, they are the least transparent and most understudied public institutions in the country, which makes figuring out what to do about prisons and really complex challenges that experienced inside them and related to them hard, because we don't really have the data or the sort of objective evidence to know what to do. So that's sort of the impetus behind this work. And you can see, with this closed doorness of the prisons, which this picture, as you might know, is a typical cell down at Southern State Correctional Facility. And one of the things I think is interesting about the timing of this work is not only did this project sort of open doors to the facility to researchers to come in and understand what was going on, really sort of cracking the black box, but it also happened during the pandemic. And so it was a really interesting time to sort of have a front row to what's going on in our prison facilities during a pandemic. And I'm noting that because we know in Vermont, we did a lot of lockdowns. So people were in these cells for long periods of time. So I think it's helpful just to note that as we look at the pictures. Let's go. So what is PRIN? So it pretty much started by the Urban Institute, like I've mentioned. The Urban Institute managed PRIN as a 5-state consortium. It was a competitive application. So the University of Vermont and the Vermont Department of Corrections put in an application together to be part of this. And really, it was an effort to say, let's crack open the black box. Let's bring research into side facilities to actually try to use data to create evidence and make change, knowing that we want to improve the health and the well-being of those inside. So this pilot phase included partnerships between departments of corrections and independent researchers, as well as a pilot facility in each state. So there were 5 participating states as part of this pilot phase: Vermont, Delaware, Colorado, Iowa, and Missouri. And the big key factors of this was we had the independent research team, a pilot prison. All of the data was going to be grounded in these new prison surveys that the researchers would create. And then the point was we would create these surveys so we could identify issues and then partner with the Department of Corrections, who would really take the lead in using that data to make change, being the ones who have the control over innovations and change. So in Vermont, what does this physical structure look like? We have the Department of Corrections, and at the beginning of this project, the Department of Corrections received a grant from Urban Institute to resource this initiative. And as part of that commitment, they were to hire a prison research innovation manager so that there would be capacity to actually manage this work. Their role was really to manage something called the steering committee, which is sort of responsible for the everyday activities of the project and make sure the researchers had access to the facilities and so forth. Southern State Correctional Facility was the pilot prison where all of this work happened. So they played a key role and were part of the steering committee. The independent research team was the University of Vermont, and that was myself and my partner, Kathy Fox, who has since retired. So she would have loved to have been here today.
She's teaching right now.
Yes, exactly. So she's not actually out there yet. And so the University of Vermont was Kathy and myself as the independent research partners, really to really develop and administer this survey and make the data available for change. And on top of this was an executive committee, and the executive committee was a lot of legislators, advocates, folks from the corrections leadership, folks from the facility, community partners, really to sort of keep an eye on everything, how's it going, and also recognizing that change needs to happen at multiple levels of the state. So this sort of 4 core partners approach is the structure of how it actually worked. So I want to highlight a bit about our role as the independent researchers. Really, that's centered on these Vermont prison surveys. And the key things around the Vermont prison surveys that highlight that central to this was using a community engaged approach to developing, administering, and analyzing these surveys. And what that really means, it's an approach to research that centers the lived experience of the folks inside the facility. So one of the challenges of prisons being sort of a black box for so many years is we like guess what's going on inside, but the people who actually know what's going on inside and what the impacts are the best are the staff who work there and the people who are incarcerated in there. So this community engaged approach really engages those populations to co-create all of the survey instruments and really make sure that the data are owned by those inside. And it's really the point of collecting all these data and doing the surveys is to create awareness of the issues and understanding of how complex they are. So really trying to use the information for that purpose, but not just to have it there and then move on, but actually have action. That's one of the really big benefits of having this steering committee and the partnership with the Department of Corrections leadership who are in a position to make change, as well as the executive committee who are in a position to make change from a policy and practice perspective as well. So having those data actually drive action and meaningful impact is a really important part of that. So I want to highlight the survey process specifically. There are 3 core elements to the survey process. The first is how we develop the surveys. When we talk about doing that community engaged approach and centering lived experience and as content expertise, I mean, Kathy and I spend a lot of time in the prison, just walking around, getting to know people, building relationships, and having an understanding of what the day-to-day activities are. We've learned through that, we built relationships with folks, incarcerated folks and staff, to understand what works best for them in terms of data collection and making sure that we could understand their lived experience best. So through that, we spend a lot of time like at night reaching staff, recognizing those work night shifts, and staff are working 16-hour shifts. So creating a meeting and inviting people to it is a no-go, more like go to where they are, but in the facility. Similar with incarcerated folks walking around and sort of being in the day room and talking to folks. And Alice has been part of this since the beginning too. So this is all good.
I'm sorry, keep going. Not me.
We don't.
The big point for this survey development was it first started with this relationship building inside the facility. So we got to know people, understand what would work for them. And we did extensive focus groups and interviews where we asked everyone who wanted to talk to us, what do you think is important for us to know about this facility? If you were to design a survey, what do you think we should ask on the survey? And really used that qualitative and storytelling information to develop these surveys. We shared draft surveys back with members of the executive committee, with our partners inside the facility to make sure, like, if we actually do this survey, is this going to be useful to you to make change? And for those inside, will it actually represent what you think is important to know about the facility? So when we created the survey, we did one for staff and one for incarcerated folks. Each survey had over 150 questions on it, which was crazy because we thought we wanted one with 30 questions on it. But it was very clear from the folks we were working with inside that we needed a survey of this length in order to capture the complexity of the issues inside. So it was really our partners, staff and incarcerated folks, who said, no, this is good. Don't remove any questions. So when we administered the survey, we've done it at 3 time points. When we administer it, we are physically on site. It's paper-based. So that really, we heard from everybody that protecting confidentiality was really, really important. Making sure that the surveys were handed from UVM researchers to staff, to incarcerated folks, and then directly back to UVM researchers. Real important to keep that sort of independence from the Department of Corrections. Once we actually administered all of the surveys, we would come back, do some data entry, do some data cleaning, and then bring all the survey results back to those in the facility. And that was part of something called the data walk. And that was, again, our commitment to the community engaged approach to research, where the survey findings needed to be shared with the participants first. So they were the first ones to see the results and had an opportunity to share feedback. So we gave them the results and said, well, what do you think is important for people to know? For certain areas and questions that were confusing to us, like, I don't know if I'm interpreting this correctly, we asked for further clarification and insights. So those sort of 3 processes are really important as the survey process. And if you're looking for more information, I left a link to a paper that we wrote about it that's published online that you can access. We then created 3 for each of the survey waves, we created a public facing report where we tried to, in simplest as we could, share all the information across both surveys across 3 years with the public. So we created these 3 reports. They're on our website right now. And after we created each one, there was also a public press release that we did with the Department of Corrections. So I'm saying that because there's like 900 questions to potentially review here, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do some highlights of the most recent survey. So, so I picked a few highlights and just sort of wanted to walk through them, but it would also like encourage anyone to look at anyone here or listening or anything to if they have further questions that they want to look at with the surveys or talk about, don't ever hesitate to reach out. So the first is around what is the purpose of prison? So like, what is the purpose of prison? And you could see everybody had 4 different options, helping people make changes for a better life, ensuring public safety, punishing people for the crimes they've committed, or preventing people from committing future crimes. And you could see sort of the responses for incarcerated folks are in orange and for staff are in blue. And what's notable is the sort of 2 biggest approaches here are around helping people make changes for a better life and ensuring public safety. And you can see sort of staff are split between those 2 as the highest priority, whereas incarcerated folks very clearly are the purpose of the prison being around helping people make changes for a better life.
So I would recommend that folks ask questions as you go along. That's okay.
100%. Yeah.
I think this is important to understand, particularly this one, in terms of people's perspectives and perception of what DOC or corrections is about.
Mhm.
I want to also remind folks that by statute, the policy in the state for Department of Corrections is rehabilitation. It is not punishment, it's rehabilitation. Brian?
Just, I don't know if there's any context for the question, but to me, it can be read 2 ways, right? What is prison doing or what it should be doing? And it seems like, I assume from the answers that it's what it should be doing. Was there any sort of cue to make them think that? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So if you look at the full report, there's some previous questions as well, like how important are each of these 4 things? How well does this prison do these things? Which one is the most important to be done?
Okay.
Yeah. And I think from that too, you see this general trend around the most important piece being helping people make changes for a better life, and also perceptions that it's not actually happening.
Right.
So, and I think that's also echoed in a lot of the narrative that you hear inside. I think a quote we hear a lot is, there's no correcting in corrections.
Kevin?
And the bar chart indicates that there were very few that answered the last 3 questions. Is that what I'm reading? That they just chose not to answer?
So the punish people and prevent people, each person chose one of these things. So if you
Oh.
add up all
Okay.
of the, like each one totals
Oh, I got
100%. Yeah.
Very good, thank you.
Yeah.
So it is interesting that for staff,
Mhm.
the most response was, and it was pretty on track, helping people make changes and ensuring public safety. That's where the staff is really coming from. There's also some for the staff that are feeling it's punishment for crimes that they've committed and preventing future crimes. So you can really see a different perspective
Mhm.
from those who are supervising, from those who are actually incarcerated. And those are important distinctions for us as a committee to keep in mind. James?
And the thing that I found most interesting, I would assume that incarcerated individuals would say, help make better changes, make better choices in life. But what surprised me when I looked at that was how few said ensure public safety, which is something I'm sure you guys did get deeper into. Why do you feel that way?
Mhm.
Why do you feel that it isn't about public safety? It's not about others. It's about me. And so, like, I would love to see Data go further down on that particular thing. Not today, but like that's something that interests me. It's a mindset issue, right? So,
And I think to that point, I think that's one of the reasons why I think this print effort is so valuable, is because these surveys raise issues, but those deeper narratives understand the context. And the people that it's most important to talk to are the folks who answer these questions. Like, I'd be curious what Geo has to say, you know, like, so Geo's here and Geo's been in the facility this whole time. I don't know, Geo, if you have anything to add on this.
You want to weigh in, Gio? And if you do, please identify yourself for the record. And welcome.
Yes, thank you. Anthony Giordano, Volunteer Coordinator for Southern State Correctional Facility. Yeah, so I have the unique ability of getting to work with UVM and DOC and the staff and kind of creating and implementing this survey, right? So I get to have the side conversations and stuff with staff. And it is important that we recognize that there has been a culture change along with staff and the incarcerated population, that we're more driven and more geared on offering support services and ensuring that we're really giving these guys the best opportunity so that they can change some of their bad habits when they reintegrate back into the community. So in my 17 years in the department, I've seen a change, a culture change, and I feel that it was changed in the positive. And the results show that, the data shows that, so.
And this is so simple and it's, I don't want to say stupid because it's not stupid, but it's so simple in terms of perception. For staff, when you say correctional officer versus guard, what comes to your mind? Facilities in other states, it's a guard. Here, by statute, it's a correctional officer. So what triggers in what you visualize in your mind when you hear the word guard versus correctional officer? And the same for our facilities. The head of the facility is the superintendent. We don't call the person a warden. So just those subtleties in terms of what language is used does carry a lot of weight. James?
And to follow up on that, so when you say simple, whether it's our policies or others, but then we're dealing with this, everything can seem simple at surface level, but all the rabbit holes you go down through after 6 layers down, it starts getting really complicated. So if you allow yourself just to take the level 1 ground surface level of anything, well, life is simple. That's a simple policy. That's a simple decision. But if you are more analytical, you start looking at things and you get down deeper and you go, that's nowhere near as simple as I thought. In fact, now I'm confused. You know what I mean? So.
And I think that's the value here,
Yeah.
is going down those rabbit holes, because simple solutions don't work, and understanding the complexity and how if you change one thing, it impacts something else and so forth is really the value. I also want to highlight.
Sorry, did you have your hand up?
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yes, go for it. So I also want to highlight the questions we had about the medication assisted treatment program inside the facility. So again, when we walked around and asked folks, you know, what are the most important things we need to talk about in all of our focus group and interviews, we heard a lot about the MAT. So we really tried to figure out how can we actually incorporate this into our surveys. So we asked both incarcerated individuals and staff to, like, do you agree or disagree with, is the MAT program implemented in a manner that supports prison operations and safety, as well as has the MAT program, if it's had a positive effect on the prison? And what's interesting here is about 50% of staff agree, like, yeah, it has been implemented in a manner that supports prison operations and safety, and 50% disagree. And similar for staff, with MAT having a positive effect on the prison, about 50% agree and 50% disagree. And you could see sort of a higher percentage of incarcerated folks view both of these questions in the positive, like having MAT being implemented in a way that promotes operations and safety, as well as having a positive impact on the prison.
I don't know how staff work in the prison. You know, is everybody cross-trained as a staffer, or could this breakdown be because some people are watching the line for 3 hours and some people are not, right?
You mean the 50-50, like
Right.
the different responses
Yes,
of who's done it? Again, it's one of those rabbit hole types of things. There's a million different reasons why people like or don't like the MAT program in the facility. And this, based on the response here, there is no difference based on position type.
Okay.
So this is sort of the overall facility perception, but we can definitely go down more rabbit holes here. Yeah. But I think that's the big thing is, you know, even though Vermont has a sort of widespread MAT and a lot of people on it, is it like 70% of the population are on MAT? We also ask this question, like, there's a lot in this program, a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of resources, yet only 37% of the folks inside the facility felt they were getting adequate treatment for their substance use disorder.
There's layers to that one.
And I think that's like layers to lots of things, but really it's like these are highlighting the issues for deeper contextual understanding. And that's like the benefit of having this relationship in the facility is to go deep on those.
So Isaac, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I was just saying, I mean, if I remember correctly, the wave one surveys from
Mhm.
2021, I think those said that only 20% of staff thought the MAT program had a positive effect on the prison, if I'm remembering correctly, something along those lines. It was majority of folks were, I think, opposed to the program. So it looks like according to wave three surveys, and I have to go back and double check this, that there's actually looks like rising support among staff for the MAT.
Yeah, and I think that, so I can't remember 2021 off the top of my head, but very possible. And again, I think it's like, so what changes have we made to this? Like, how have we used the data to actually dive deeper into the understanding and actually make changes? So I think those are great things to keep exploring.
I think, and there's a couple things that I want to say. Brian, you brought up about the training piece, and I think if you look at age 32, there is a piece in there that would have correctional officers be trained in the MAT program and how you deal with it. That's a piece of age 32. So this is how we connect the dots in terms of what we hear in testimony. And when we start dealing with the policy language, and we start looking at language, this is how we connect the dots. So I'll just put this out on the table for people to process. The other thing too, and I appreciate, Isaac, what you brought up about the survey a few years ago. MAT was first rolled out. And I'm going to be critical of the Department of Corrections. The commissioner was not commissioner then. He's not responsible. It was rolled out haphazardly. It was rolled out, okay, we got to do it. We're going to do it. Everybody is going to get some MAT. Everybody's going to get some medication. We're going to roll it out in every facility. Correctional officers were not brought on board at the beginning to really understand what the goal was to establish the program. They felt that it was contributing to the offender's addiction. So that's where there was so much pushback from the correctional officers in doing this. There was quite a bit of uproar at the time. And that was a failure on DOC's part. They didn't bring along their staff to understand this transition was going to be happening. And it was a failure for offenders because they had higher expectations than what was realistic. So I want to put that out there on the table. It's taken a real long time to turn that ship around for our correctional officers. And there is still that division. Now, this is one facility. You go in the other facilities and this may be the same or it may be different. My hunch is it's probably a little different, depending on the facility. The other piece is adequate treatment from RSUD. They may want a different type of medication. They may think, well, I should have something else beside the Suboxone or whatever abuse that they're getting. And the one thing that really struck me in this print project at the end, and this is kind of a sidestep here, but I think it feeds into this a little bit. There was a question that was asked about access to health care while they were incarcerated. And the response was they had better health care on the outside than they did in the facility. It was more timely on the outside than in the facility where they had to put in a pink slip and get, not an appointment, but they had to wait longer than they thought they should have to see a medical provider. And the reason for that is they said, well, on the outside, I can just go to the emergency room and I'm seen. So they were comparing it to what they experienced for healthcare in the public, where most of us have to wait for a doctor's appointment. We don't go to the emergency room for our healthcare unless it's an emergency. But that was a little interesting tidbit that came out that, wait a minute, the bulk of our folks who are being incarcerated may not have a primary care provider, may go to the emergency room for their health care. That's another important piece to keep in mind.
I think even just, as we are on like slide 3, it's also like how many opportunities there are to go deeper and the need to go deeper. Like, because none of these solutions are easy. And as you point to, when you come up with a solution, good intents don't mean good impacts. And I think the implementation part is where it's so important to understand and recognize where it's worked and where it hasn't and correct course. And I think that's one of the things that this helps us sort of understand. And I also want to highlight just another big thing that we heard a lot about when we were inside is when folks end up in the correctional system, we're trying to provide services to help, but really there's this entire history, this childhood, of how complex a lot of the conditions are for folks before they show up. And so a lot of what we heard was there's such a ton of things to help people with, and it actually starts at like day 0 of their life, not when they actually enter the correctional facility. And so as part of that, in response to that, we asked the Adverse Childhood Experiences 10-question checklist for all incarcerated folks inside. And that just asks everybody to answer sort of yes or no to traumatic events that have happened before they turned 18. And really, the higher your ACE score, so you get a 1 point for every yes you answer. So the higher your ACE score, the worse your health and sort of life outcomes are. And by the time that you get an ACE score greater than 6, I believe it's like your life expectancy reduced by 20 years. That's pretty intensive. And so we've noticed here is that the highest frequency of ACE scores are above 7 in this population, just really indicating sort of what's happening to these folks before they turn 18 and the risk of entering the carceral system. And one of the ACE score questions is about their personal history. When they were a kid, did they have a parent that went to prison? And 40% of folks said yes.
Troy, and then,
Me?
Yes.
That second data point, that
Mhm.
history with incarcerated parent, another rabbit hole, I get it. Is there a longitudinal study? Like, how exponential is that becoming? Right? If 60% of our currently incarcerated Vermonters had, or 40%, right, is that going to become 60% because?
Substance use disorder is.
Well, that and because,
generational.
that's the
Grandparents.
the
The grandchildren.
generational impact on this, and is it exponential?
Yeah, and so I think I'll say we asked this question for the last 3 years, and this slide could be the same one I use all 3 years. This hasn't changed. But we do know that if you have a parent who is incarcerated, the multi-generational cycle of incarceration is very real.
Yeah.
And that's just also to this point, we asked the folks inside right here, are you currently the parent of someone who's under 18? And 58% said yes. And I think that's one of the challenges and sort of is those are kids that sort of need this sort of wraparound help right now, not so that we wait until they show up in the prison, but really more to be like, we know you're at risk right now. How can we help? And I'll put a little plug in. I think you're hearing from Kids Apart next week is we're trying to work with them to help gather data and evaluate their program because they're the only program in the state that actually touches these kids right now. So these kids just fall through every system's crack.
So that's the question. 40% had a parent, 58% of them have kids.
Yep.
Right? That does suggest that it's moving in the wrong direction.
Exactly.
And having a generational impact.
Yeah, and I think that's why one of the reasons we actually want to keep asking the ACE scores because
Yeah.
things are shifting in different directions as well in terms of poverty gaps, substance use disorder, and therefore, like I could imagine those ACE scores actually getting higher over time. And so then it becomes more as like this spectrum of
Yeah.
things. Like where do we wait? Do we wait until people show up knowing that it's increasing, or do we also really recognize the role in the spectrum? And so, yeah, just mentioning the
So we have some more questions.
yes.
Well, that's one that I could probably apply it to 20 different times. So when there are things like these ACE studies,
Mhm.
are there contingent studies of the general, like this Vermont population?
Yeah, And it's viewed, the general population is much closer to like less than like 0 or less than 2.
It's
So
done
it's
in
like-
all of our schools.
Yeah.
It's done like in your middle school at the beginning, and it's also done at your high school. And I'm not sure about elementary school.
Yeah.
But it's done
I think it
statewide
was,
in our schools.
would be, I think useful if maybe like this, and I'm sure there are similar, data displays. If the contrasts were shown.
Totally,
Yeah.
that's a great point. And it also helps also because like, solving this challenge happens outside of corrections and sort of like how we actually connect with those dots is really important. Yeah.
So that's important what Abby just said, because what's happening here is by not dealing with it on the front end in our communities, what's happening is the person is then ending up in corrections. And by that fact alone, it's putting pressure on our state budget because it's DOC's budget that has to deal with it. It's a real shift in budgeting.
Yeah, and even thinking community health for our state, like help these little kids.
I had a couple of different points I want to make. Bear with me. First, Haley did double check the data from the 22 survey. We saw that 79% of staff thought that the MAT program had a negative effect.
And that was what year?
That was in 22, is that right, Ann?
Yeah, I don't think the question was asked in 2021.
Okay.
At least not for me.
Okay. But so we saw, a pretty major shift in just 1 year. I think that also tracks with our work with the Turning Point Centers that we've talked a little bit about. I know Tracy and Mike and Johnny were in. And we have woven them into the correctional academy, as you know. So I think there's some parallels with H32 when we talk about training, and some of the work that's going on in the academy right now to humanize addiction in our system. So I'm not going to point to causation there, but I think those are really good trajectories to see that our staff, I think with the Turning Point program, they're really getting to know the coaches. Gio can speak to the work that he does with Johnny at the facility, which I hear really wonderful things about. But also to connect to this slide, I remember I was at Southern State, I was down with Gio, and I was with Monique when she was the living unit supervisor. And we were walking through one of the units, and this staff member at Southern knew every single person's name in the unit. And I was just amazed, and she had such a rapport with them. And I was, curious about that. So I asked her, like, how do you know these guys so well? Turns out she had worked at DCF, and she knew many of those men when they were in DCF custody. And it is always very powerful when you speak to an incarcerated person and they talk to you about living their entire life in some form of custody. So it is, to Hedger's point, it is very much sometimes a closed system of the cycle. And I think you see that, these ACE scores are astronomical. Having worked in community health, looking at those scores, the 7 to 10, that is terrifying.
Yeah.
How can a child have reached their fullest potential when they're dealing with those kind of adverse experiences? It's really stunning.
And Isaac, I missed asking you to go forward one slide, so we
Oh,
go
sorry.
forward one slide, so.
He was doing so well.
Sorry.
Yeah, I know, we're getting there.
Yeah.
But this is the slide I was talking about that everyone saw, like, that's also sort of speaks to this, what's in the pipeline, and again, where do our kids need help?
Is that the full population?
This is of everyone at Southern who answered this, 58% said yes, that they are currently a parent of someone under 18. And there's more questions on this in the survey, and again, the rabbit holes is like, I think one of the reasons I'm grateful for this opportunity to be here is because when you have questions as the policymakers who are actually guiding the future of this system in our state, going down those rabbit holes is like so important. And so I just want to make sure that we sort of offer our resources at UVM to support those rabbit holes and whatever we can do to help. Let's go for the next slide. So now I'm going to go through a series of slides that these are the actual data that we shared back as part of that data walk that we talked about. And this was comparing the 2024 to 2021 survey data. And again, of the 150 questions, I picked just a few, but these are ones that really were important to the staff and the incarcerated folks inside. So I want to make sure to elevate those here. So you can see if you look at these sort of generally, anything that looks blue is a disagree, and anything that looks orange is an agree. So in 2021, when we looked about, are there enough staff to actually run this facility? You see all that blue. And the blue is pretty big in 2024 as well, even though it's headed in the right direction. And you see similar things in when we ask folks about, does your work schedule cause conflict at home? And that's something we heard a lot about, is showing up at work and not being able to go home and meet, be there for birthday parties, or picking kids up after a baseball game, or being part of sort of family commitments. Like that plays a big role. And so we've seen a lot of people, the orange here indicates, yes, this is causing conflict at home. So that's been pretty steady, I think, over the course of the PRIN study. This is also a big one here in terms of generally staff morale is high. 2021, we had low staff morale. Like all that blue is pretty much everybody saying, I disagree, that staff morale is high. But in 2024, you can start to see trends in the right direction, with more orange showing up, more people saying, yes, staff morale is high, but still a big chunk of blue. But, like Gio was saying earlier, he's starting to feel more culture change. And I think, Alice, we felt that when we were down there last October. So I'm really interested to see how this has changed even next time we do this. All right.
Is there a quick snapshot? I'll turn to DOC here on staff turnover between 2021 and 2024. Like, how are these numbers impacted by folks just not realizing the suck?
So 2024 is not done yet. I mean, we have pieces, but we don't have the full calendar year data yet. But 2023 was the first year that we saw a higher retention of staff than the number of people we lost. That was the first year, and as long as the data goes back. And so we are seeing a positive attrition rate for the first time.
In 2023, a majority of those staff would have answered the 2021 survey
if they had been working here at that time.
Probably weren't. Some might have been, some might not.
When you say attrition numbers, is that year over year?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're looking at it now year over year. It's actually a fairly complicated model to build.
Yeah.
But that was the first sign of progress that we saw attacking that. And we know that's the key to the staffing challenges, not improvement, it's the retention piece.
Representative, I put this is a public staffing report. It's on our website, updated as of but anyway.
Yeah, my overall question is how much of the 2024 data is from folks who didn't didn't provide 2021 data? That's my question.
Yeah, so when we take this information, it's completely confidential and anonymous. So we don't have specifics, but what we do ask folks is, how long have you been employed at the facility? And you can see sort of gaps and changes, like, the number of people who've been employed for more than 5 years drops. So you can see that newer people are there, but this is, again, one of those sort of, right now I'm like in my head keeping track of all the future analyses we need to do, because I haven't looked at these responses based on, how long someone's been in the facility. And in this data set, we have access to both of that.
And we would have data showing how many people 2024 were in the facility in 2021. But you wouldn't be able to directly link it, but it would give you a sense.
Sure.
Of
And whoops, the comment?
What sort of crosstabs could you break out on the staff there? So based on like the satisfaction survey, can you tell what age they are, if they're married, if they have kids? Because I think for me, that'd be a huge factor. It's not so much money as time with their family and everything these days.
Totally. So we can do lots of things. And specifically, we have age, length of time in the facility. One thing we don't currently have in this version is, do you have kids, or what your marital status is for staff? But we heard a lot of feedback on that, like when staff would hand us back surveys when we administered this, like, you need to get a little bit deeper into sort of the impact at home. So as we think about expanding the survey moving forward, that's an area that we want to add more information on, but definitely work with the staff to see what's important.
That's great.
Yeah. I also want to point out sort of this question D here on, my coworkers show signs of stress. Like, that is big. We see a lot of stress in the facility, all that orange. And while 2024 is better than 2021, I also want to point when we look at this question in specifically in 2022, 100% of respondents said yes. And so like it was, what you can even notice here is we're comparing sort of our wave 3 survey data to the baseline data. But what we actually saw was like in 2021, it gave us awareness of the issues. In 2022, things generally got worse. Like things went worse, which was like really hard, but really valuable information to have, because if we don't know it, can't do something about it. And so then in 2024, you start to see this come back up. So what we're looking at here is baseline to 2024, but I also just really want to acknowledge how much better this is from 2022.
And I would flag, just to give a bit of context and remind you all, July, midpoint of 2022 was the worst of our staffing crisis in totality. That's when we hit our high water.
Commissioner, could you just identify yourself for the record?
No.
Because when you.
I'd like to be here surreptitious. My name is Nick Dillon, the Commissioner of Corrections.
You can go ahead. So another thing that we definitely heard a lot was like a feeling of disconnect between the facility and central office staff. So there was definitely we really wanted to include that relationship on the survey. And so you can see in 2021 that there was a lot of disagreement about the department communicating a clear vision or mission for corrections. And there was a lot of disagreement with the statement that there are discussions involving all staff about the vision for corrections and ways to achieve it. And you can see that there's been significant improvement in that in 2024. So that is, statistically significantly different from 2021 to 2024 and headed in the right direction with room to keep going. And similar, again, the question about the department, central office has a clear understanding of what it's like for staff to work in the prison. Again, you see that same trend with a lot of disagreement around that statement in 2021 and heading in the right direction in 2024, but still a lot of room for growth in that area. And the department takes the things I say seriously and treats me and my ideas with respect. Again, pretty big jump from 2021 to 2024 and those saying yes and agreeing there, and it's still a significant room for improvement. We also talked about job satisfaction. Staff are really interested in sharing their perspectives on their compensation for the duties and tasks they're required to perform. And again, similar to the perceptions of the relationship with the Department of Corrections, you're seeing trends in the right direction in this way as well. And similar with leadership in the prison, showing appreciation for staff in meaningful ways, a pretty significant jump from 2021 to 2024.
I might have missed this earlier. How many people did you actually ask in the Department of Corrections?
Yeah, great question. So the surveys were intended to be a census. So they were offered to everyone who works in the prison or everyone who's incarcerated in the prison. And it's pretty much anybody who's working when we show up that week or is incarcerated that week. So for staff, for both incarcerated and staff, one of the great things is across all 3 years, we've had high response rates of over 70%, which is pretty unheard of with surveys, and pretty unheard of for surveys because usually you get like response rates of like 30%. And so we have 70%. We really attribute that to the fact that it was the folks inside who created these surveys. And the other thing about those response rates is it's not just that so many people completed it and handed it in, but they actually completed every single question of the 150 questions. So our completion rates for each of the surveys were closer to 99%, which is like blew our minds. And so it's like, okay, but it was affirming that we're giving these surveys. But the actual raw numbers for each year is it's about 100 staff respondents and about 210 incarcerated folks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And are there like written remarks that correspond with each of these questions? Like, for example, like stress, for me, yeah, like it'd be weird if it wasn't stressful. You're working a prison, right?
Yeah.
But like what's causing that stress? Are people afraid to go to work? Is there like a safety component of it? Is it stress because of like, I might get that phone call to get called in, you know? It's-
So there's different ways we can look at that. So we have a whole section on traumatic experiences at work that we can correlate with those questions specifically. And like exposure to violence, weapons, et cetera, in the facility and perceptions of safety as well. So there's a lot that we can do with the data to do these crosstabs. As well as that's sort of the point of us doing the data walk at the end, is to ask those questions and get the narrative. Like, you know, here's this statistic, this point that you've shown us, but help us understand the nuance. And really doing these sort of facilitated discussions and feedback there is really important. And so that's a big part of the process. Hasn't quite, you'll see it. And when I get into my future slides, you'll see how all of that's coming in terms of more in reporting.
Thank you.
So continuing around job satisfaction, we've heard a lot about how promotions are done in the facility. Again, I'm not going to like point out the details because you can see these same trends here. Orange is good, and we can see it heading in the right direction. I think this fourth question here, question D, is important. If I have a chance, I will change to some other job outside of corrections at the same rate of pay. And here we want more blue. We want people saying no, like I'm here. And again, you can see sort of a lot of people would still leave, which is challenging given sort of staffing levels right now and how important that is for running the facility. But we can see it heading in the right direction.
Just reminding myself, this is December 24, right?
This is actually March of 2024.
Oh, okay.
So if I can also interject here, that there has been a change in superintendent from 21 to 24. A change in superintendent changes the culture in the facility. Just going to be blunt.
Yep.
You change the
In the
top.
top 3 tiers of leadership at the facility.
So when you change things at the top in a facility, it changes everything down to line staff and inmates.
I think it's interesting too, because as I was saying, sort of in our beginning slides of sort of the since the beginning of this project, Commissioner Demmel is the 3rd commissioner that we've worked with. And I will give you credit, like, you know, what's interesting is when we did the first survey, we did that before you started, and then it was like, oh, welcome here. Good luck. And I really appreciated the way you responded, was like, this is real. Like, let's open the doors and really recognize these challenges, because we need an all hands on deck approach to solving them. And so I just really want to like highlight that, because if we pretend that these problems don't exist, we can't actually address them, which is what we need. All right, so we'll move on to incarcerated folks. And so while we did see a more shift from 2021 to 2024 in the right direction for staff, we've seen sort of the responses for incarcerated folks pretty stagnant, with not much change from 2021 to 2024. And as a statistician, I look at this and say, oh, our questions are valid because everything looks the same. But as a human, I'm like, oh no, we need actually change here. So just noting that we see a lot in terms of individuals feeling prepared for release, a lot of folks inside just not feeling ready to be released, which is essential if we want, if we don't want them coming back. And so we need these systems and resources in place. So most people not feeling ready for release, and most people feeling that there are not enough staff to help them get ready for release. That's why we see those big blue chunks for both of those questions.
And the thing too, that I've heard this for a number of years, and I don't know if this is coming from language that is used with folks who are incarcerated, staff to incarcerated folks, or vice versa. When we've been in our correctional facilities and we ask folks who are incarcerated, what's your reentry plan? Do you have a reentry? And they said, no, nobody's talked to me about reentry plan. But then when you talk to the staff, yes, there is a reentry plan. So I don't know if it's semantics, something is disconnect, that there's language that's used from staff and the person that's incarcerated doesn't process what that word means. But I have heard that for many years. No, I have no reentry plan.
I think one thing just to note about that, I think
that plays into that.
there's also just noting, like, that's also another one of those rabbit holes, because it's also a lot of the system stuff. And like what we've heard a lot is things as simple as like having an ID ready. Or, like the systems of, do I have a ride home? What is the plan? Do I need to talk to 10 different people at 10 different times with 10 different 1-800 numbers when I get out?
I don't have a phone.
And I don't have a phone. So like those systems for being able to set up when we get out, and I'll share briefly about sort of more projects that are trying to specifically go down some of that rabbit holes as well.
The one other, sorry, can I just?
Go ahead.
add on that? The one other thing I would flag here is the experience of somebody who is sentenced versus somebody who is detained, and the reentry work that is done is vastly different. And
This doesn't differentiate between the two, right?
Not this,
No.
no, but we can, we asked everybody what their current status is, and we asked them, are you currently detained? Are you currently sentenced? Or are you currently here on a like technical violation, like back, sent back in?
And many of the folks, as you mentioned, many of the folks in Springfield are sentenced. That tends to be more of a sentenced population than some of our other facilities, but it's still mixed. And I think you raised a good point earlier when you were talking about the experience, how people experience healthcare in our system. I think there are a lot of parallels here where they actually are getting quite good access to healthcare comparatively, but even compared to the community, and yet they don't feel that way. They are getting access to reentry services, but it doesn't feel that way. And so for me, that tells me we have some gap that's getting created there that we need to cut down on. So I think that's an area where we're very interested in exploring. And that's not to say we do reentry well or perfectly right now. I think there's a lot of room to improve.
I mean, I don't want to belabor, but Alice hit it first, and then Commissioner said it too, is that perception is not always reality. And so it doesn't matter if reality is one thing. You could have every single skill and everything in front of you that the average person has, but if you don't believe you do, so I'm sure you have more data that goes down to like, well, why do you feel this way? But it's just interesting that whenever statistics would come out, statistics, but I like that the stuff is down below them.
Exactly.
And it's just it's also one of my biggest frustrations, statistics, because people, like I say all the time, we're like, well, this is what it says. No, it doesn't. That's not what it says. Go down 6 levels, 7 levels, and then you're going to get your answer.
I totally appreciate that. And I think that's one of the things that's worked well in this project is these statistics start the conversation.
Yes.
And because they are trusted by the folks inside, it means we actually are all looking at the same thing. And to have everyone from their different lens, staff, incarcerated folks, leadership, policymakers, researchers, advocates, looking at the same thing and trusting it is the starting point for people being able to share their interpretation and for the deeper understanding. And I think that's what's missing in particular. And also, like with the data that isn't coming from the folks inside, there isn't that initial focus or trust that the data can have. And so it gives us that opening to understand the why. And so here we move on to some of these questions we've been talking about in terms of these ones. More about sort of planning for release. Sorry, I'm sort of off cycle with you. That's okay. So these are, again, similar trends around planning for release. But if we want to move into the next one, which is these are some of the stuff we've been talking about with perceptions with healthcare services. Getting the medical treatment I need in the prison when I need it. What's interesting here is you see more people disagreeing with this in 2024 versus 2021. But the opposite for the mental health care treatment I need in this prison when I need it, more people feeling yes. And so again, this would be another one where this is a great statistic to create awareness, but the need is to understand is also there as well.
Are we talking the same health contractor at that point in 21 and 24?
No, no, it went vital cord to WellPath. WellPath would have started, would have been 23 or 20?
July 1, 23.
23.
Yeah.
So it'd been there a year with the 24 data.
I mean, is that troubling, or is that like, how do you feel about that?
Well,
With-
go back to what I said earlier, how people are perceiving they get better medical care outside than they do in prison.
Okay.
Because they go to the emergency room
Okay, gotcha.
outside. They
All
get it immediately. Where in the prison, they have to submit a pink slip to get seen in
To
the
work harder.
infirmary.
Right.
So it's like us calling for an appointment. You don't get in right off. You may not get in for 3 months, or you may get in
Okay.
2 weeks, but they're not used to experiencing that when they've been in the public, because they may not have a primary care provider, they may not have insurance, and they go to the emergency room, so they're seen immediately, or they call the ambulance to pick them up. So they're seen immediately. That's the point that they're referring to.
So WellPath would have been online in our system for about 9 months when this started, or when this was taken. So I think, WellPath was probably just then starting to really kind of turn the corner and implement their model. Staffing during this time amongst the healthcare provider was pretty low, especially at Springfield. And that stabilized a lot. So the time of when this was taken is a little tricky just with that transition happening. So I don't know exactly what this tells us. I think it's positive that they feel better about mental health, but obviously they feel worse about physical health. So
And I think this is also one of those things where the rabbit hole is so deep and the stories are so real. And I know when we heard a lot about this when we started developing the surveys, and we weren't quite sure how to actually do it justice, because we knew how complex it was in terms of we have this sort of for-profit contract healthcare provider, and that the contract was changing. And so we were trying to figure how could we actually make this information useful? And so I think, again, this is another one of those areas where we feel like we've done the tip of the iceberg, but as we investigate further, more narrative behind this, as well as potentially more questions on the survey around this, would be something we think about. So then we move into idle time, issues of idle time. And I want to just preface, I think this is one of those challenges is when we first showed up at this facility in February of 2020 for the kickoff, just before COVID, it was the one thing we kept hearing was there's nothing to do here. People were sitting in the day room all day without stuff to do. And so COVID did not help that, but I would also note that COVID didn't it didn't start with COVID. It was happening before. And so having access to activities and things to do is something that I think has been a real need that this project has highlighted. So we could see that having access to activities to promote well-being and growth is getting better from 2021 to 2024. But it's been pretty low. And Gio could probably talk a lot about all of the new activities that are coming in. And again, I'd be interested to see where this is now, especially with all the work that Gio's been doing and others have been doing.
One thing I would like to see, this is all just the one institution, right? Facilities. I would love to see, for example, the same information for Mississippi or maybe even Northwest, but I really want to see because one of the things down there, I'm not saying it's better, but when we had our presentation for you guys before, different activities they have compared to here, and so if we have things that are better here and they have things that are better here, how do we integrate those two things? And so
I can respond to that a little bit, and I don't want to get ahead of Abby's slides, but
why ahead?
no, I think it's a great point, right? Because we're looking, these are snapshots at one facility, and as the chair mentioned, it's very true. Gio could tell you every facility is a different culture, history. It reflects the geography of the community. Newport is going to be different than Southern, which is different from CRCF. And so we really want to get a better sense of this data, which, and I just can't thank Abby and Kathy, who's not with us today, enough for sticking with this project over multiple years when there were some pretty critical points when this could have failed, this entire project, and they stuck it out with us. And this is independent, third-party academic research that does not touch, it's independent of the department. And so when I, as a policymaker for the department, look at this, I can trust it. And I know Kathy and Abby, I know how just how much hard work went into gathering this data and validating it. But to exactly your point, I want to know, how does this compare to Northwest? Where are these real critical pain points in our system. Where are there areas we really target facility by facility? And this is what makes this data so valuable, is it guides that policymaking. So with that in mind, we are planning to expand this survey to all of our facilities in partnership with UVM, and we can talk about what that looks like. But that's a really exciting kind of next chapter, and I can say that is probably unique among the 5 states that did this brain project. And I was just down in DC with the Urban Institute talking about some of this work. Vermont, we I think are an exception. A lot of the other states didn't get this far. And I think it's a testament to the department, to UVM for sticking it out. I don't know, Abby, if you have anything you want to say on that.
And to our amazing folks at Southern.
Yes.
Yeah, amazing folks at Southern. I'm going to give a lot of shout out to Superintendent Merrill and Geo, who really continue to make this happen down there. And it's that strong partnership. Like, I can show up at Southern and be welcomed right in, which is really great. And so Geo and Michaela have been fantastic. So noting here, so being that there's a lot of times where there's nothing productive to do. And again, we've heard a lot of desire, like, I am here. Let me do something that will help me better myself, make amends for what I've done, and let me be ready to be sort of on the outside as well. And finally, just moving into the last piece here around what we heard a lot about is commissary. And this is something, again, I think that speaks to, there's a lot of things I could point to, but because we're on this slide, I'll point to this one. This is something that speaks to the importance of this being a community engaged or community driven approach. If Kathy and I went in the facility and created this survey, we wouldn't have thought to ask questions about commissary at all, but we heard a lot about the challenges with commissary. And so it was very clear that this needed to be on the survey as well as part of the data walk. So we can see that folks are concerned that there's not enough vendors to choose from, and there's not enough options for things to buy, and this has been a consistent challenge.
Maybe you could explain what the commissary is, because we have new members to DSC in this room.
I'm gonna let Isaac take that.
Commissary.
It is commissary.
What is commissary?
Because I don't know what you're.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
0.
Oh, perfect.
Commissary is essentially a private vendor of things, food, some clothing material,
So
it's a lot of food, toiletry items that aren't kind of the standard issue.
Food is not, don't confuse it with the regular meals. that
Right,
we
it's
get.
just like
This is different.
snack
Snack
foods
foods,
or
I would say.
things that people
Vending
can buy
machines.
above what is provided.
Vending machines.
Books. I mean, there's some like religious materials, shoes.
Through an
There's the
industry
rub.
contractor.
Yeah.
Right.
One of the things I think I would do, I'm looking at Troy here, some commissary items
He's
in.
got a bill on this.
I do.
They might be more expensive than you see in like Walmart, they might be more expensive than you see in
Oh, they
other
are.
prisons
Yeah.
in
Might.
different countries. Part of that is because Vermont doesn't have the same economy of scale that other states do, since our system is a lot smaller, but.
Well, I mean, the national data is pretty alarming too on the profit margins for.
Yeah,
for
Now, it's worth noting that the state also makes money off of this.
that
There's
was
a
my
commission
question.
that the state collects off of the sales. But all of that money in Vermont anyway, this isn't true everywhere, but in Vermont, all of that money is invested in the recreation fund and places that then turn around to benefit the incarcerated population. So Vermont itself isn't like adding money to the general fund based on commissions. It's going back into the facilities.
And can you and I started this conversation this summer, when I gave you a heads up on my bill. Didn't you say there's some statutes that are currently in the way of how we might want to tweak this?
So I haven't looked too closely at the Vermont set of statutes. There are different ways to do commissary. Vermont contracts it out. So we have a private company that provides this service. And they do everything. They do all the procurement, the buying of the stuff. They bring it here, they distribute it. I mean, they at least distribute it to the facility. Then our staff actually distribute it within the facility. So there's been different approaches to this. New York State took that whole process in-house.
Right.
And so New York State buys the stuff, does all, but they have had a lot of challenges because they have to follow the state procurement rules, which then also drives up cost. And they haven't actually been able to really drive it down, and they can't access the sweeping amount of products because they don't have vendors under contract that they can buy from wholesale. That's not saying that model wouldn't work. It just, I think you'd have to tinker with it a little bit. And then there's others who've, you know, tried other models. I haven't seen it great, frankly, but
You haven't seen.
I have not.
I think we hear a lot about this, and I think it is, but it's also not unique to just sort of commissary. It's this concept of like relying on outside contractors to provide these services, and like they are very expensive. You know, when we walk in and we talk to folks, we're handed sheets of like, this is what you can get somewhere else. A need for like art supplies, books. The cost of this is just astronomical compared to how much people make in terms of the jobs inside. But you see the similar kinds of challenges when you start talking about like the GTL tablets and communication. So I just want to highlight, like, this is a rabbit hole that
Yeah.
So this is sort of the communication tablets, the tablets that folks have inside to do, to actually communicate with folks, the phone calls.
Also the other
Video
piece.
visit.
Yeah, so those are expensive compared to like, contracting with outside contractors is good and bad. Like it's good and bad. It presents, a way to do things and challenges. And it also, like, I think it's just important to note the cost for the folks inside and what it means they can access and what they can't access.
We have another question here.
Well, not any questions to comment, but part of it, and I don't know what the pricing is, and I know we're not gonna get into that right now. But if you go buy a bag of flour at a convenience store in Cabot, it's gonna cost more than it does at Walmart, substantially more. So the economies of scale are a lot of it, and it's not quite a direct correlate. I can only imagine what the cost of getting goods into the commissary is. You're not just pulling a truck up that's not being monitored by someone, I would presume.
It'd be interesting to figure out sort of the profit of the company that runs this too.
Oh, I'm sure they're not doing it, they're operating at a loss, but they're like, inherently are gonna be very real expenses that expense structures that aren't experienced by a large scale general retailer.
I've got a whole file on this rabbit hole.
These are.
Very quiet.
Catch up with you.
Let me see what I have.
Bill's coming out.
Let's talk about one
But
that's coming.
I want to catch up with you off, why
The
not?
bind that the state gets in on this topic is the alternative to contracting it out is to do it in-house. And in order to do that, whether it's commissary or the tablet and communication system we would have to build all of that infrastructure. And particularly in Vermont, where we just really struggle to create economies of scale to begin with, I think it would be very costly. And I think in my mind, there's a constant tension between how much can the correction system do in-house and do well versus, can we find vendors that provide a service that is cheaper for, it would cost particularly as it relates, I think, to the telecommunications side, it would cost us an inordinate amount of money to build the infrastructure for that. And I don't even know how we would do it. The commissary side, maybe there's an easier pathway there, but I've raised this, I'm very close with the commissioner in New York State. And he and I have had a lot of conversations about this because we're equally frustrated. But we have totally different, we represent opposite ends of the spectrum on commissary. And so I'm skeptical that we could do it really well in-house either. That doesn't mean there isn't a better solution. We haven't found it.
Healthcare system.
Healthcare.
Big example of this, our out-of-state contract, we depend on contracts for a lot of these critical services. And those are for profit companies.
And he mentioned GTL, somebody mentioned GTL. We're actually transitioning telecommunication provider also, so that's a difference. We're already. Remember when that's.
And I think that like a lot of this is the point of like, this helps raise issues for these kinds of conversations because it is like, there are lots of places that need help. Lots of places that need help, and there's no easy solutions, because if it was easy to change it, we could do it tomorrow. But like, it doesn't mean that the need for the change isn't there. It's how to do it. That's sort of the important piece.
Sorry,
yeah.
I don't mean to cut you off, Abby. I mean, I would just add one other kind of like layer to the commissary conversation, and that is, I think there's a couple of things happening. People think it's too expensive. They're right. People don't get access to everything they want. But I served in Afghanistan, and we had all of our stuff flown in too. And when you're isolated, when you're separated from what you are used to, you tend to rely on this. It's like a hook back into society. Yeah. And then when that gets disrupted, or it is a disproportionate dysregulating event to what you think. Like, I didn't get my honey bun today. That's a big deal. Versus like, if Alice didn't get her honey bun today, like, she might be okay.
No, he's back home. Finally. I couldn't resist.
Yeah. I can't recover from that though.
Since we're having a
I
little
finally
levity,
made you speechless.
since we're having a little levity, I'd love to see the results of this if you took this to Sandals down in the Bahamas and see what the employees.
Well, they didn't get their martini, right?
Well, I'm sure. I mean, are we surprised with this data? I'm not saying good or bad. I'm just saying that's the nature of beast.
Yeah.
And it's good that we have the data so we can try to improve where we need to, but you really wouldn't expect much different,
I
would you?
think the issue is the cost, because
Well,
these
yes.
folks don't have access to money
Exactly.
unless they have family members that are providing them some money. So some folks can't even access because they
Right.
don't have the cash, or they don't have somehow to pay for it.
Yeah.
That's the other piece here. I know exactly what the commissioner was saying. If you're isolated, you depend on these things, but I think the other piece of this, a lot of these folks may not be able to access it because they don't have the financial ability to do
Same
it, which
bill.
goes back
Same
to,
bill.
the work program and what they get paid for. And if you are disengaged from your family, you don't have the family to back you up, they're not gonna give you money.
And I think that keys into the right point. I think that's part of what your bill is trying to do. But it's not, I'm skeptical that doing this model a different way would in fact make the products cheaper. Because I think we would not be able to create the same economies that a private company or even a nonprofit could. I don't think there are nonprofits operating in the space, but which is why I think the wage side of that equation actually probably gets you closer to
Yeah.
your goal.
And-
Not saying you shouldn't do both or whatever.
What about policy that caps profit for Keith?
What happens if they are just like?
I don't do what if legislate very well, but.
But Troy, how are you supposed to, are you gonna go check out their books?
Oh, there's some pretty alarming
Yeah.
data on their profit.
There's no way we could do it cheaper.
Retail.
No way.
We'll get into it.
Yeah.
Here's a bill, we'll do our work.
There's a way to address that. Can't do it with traffic though.
We'll work on it. We got a lot of heads at the table, a lot of brains. We got a lot of brains. We'll put the brains
Administer
to
cost
work.
plus fixed fees.
So what might be helpful, Isaac, is if we sort of go through the next one pretty quickly, because it's more of the same, so move into next step. So also just want to highlight a lot of the work that has been done at Southern over this time, like changes that were physically made at the facility. There was an implementation of an honors unit, which is indirect supervision and self-governance for folks inside. The creation of a coffee shop, which is skill building and career building for the folks who manage and operate that thing, as well as amazing for fostering community. It's a really great place for people to come together and humanize the facility. And there's also the creation of innovation councils, which GEO has really sort of resurrected. They've struggled immensely for a long time. And GEO really came in, and those concepts around those innovation councils are really committed to that participatory approach to change. The folks who really need to tell the impact of the issues need to be part of the process. And so they use the data to help guide, to help focus conversations, to help make facility level changes. And I know that GEO's got great plans for for keeping that going for the incarcerated folks and expanding to staff, which is something that's been a challenge as part of this process, but really important for moving forward.
I think, Haley, we shared the op-ed, right, the writing that incarcerated folks in the incarcerated council wrote. Do we do that with?
I will.
Okay, we will. We have a piece of writing from the incarcerated guys in Gio's group that we'd like to share with the committee, talking about their experience with PRIN. And we're gonna share that with lawmakers.
So if we want to then be cognizant of time, sort of skip ahead to sort of our lessons learned at sort of the end of this 5 years. Largely that like, we know we need change and it is slow and it is complicated. And one of the things in particular with PRIN in this process that we've noted is really important is having like champions in all these different partnerships is so essential. Otherwise people get stuck sort of doing their day job and it just goes away. And so making sure we have those like institutionalized is really important. We've seen culture change at SSCF and this empower to innovate and shift away from saying no to everything. It's just a security focus. And I think one of the things that's been really important about that is sort of the ability to fail as well. Like you can take risks, you can try. If it doesn't work, let's shift focus rather than sort of hide it. We've also noted the value of the independent research. It really helps build trust with sort of all the key partners to create awareness and understanding. And we've really used this time to identify some best practices for research inside facilities, which is important because like we said, it is the least transparent and most understudied institution. So if we need to grow transparency in this space, we've learned a lot on how to do it over the last several years. We also know that Department of Corrections has taken this amazing approach to opening their doors to more community partners for coming in and doing work inside the facilities, which gives the sort of the unintended impact of like, why do you do things this way? And allows folks to question practices. And again, it's part of that like opening doors, something that hasn't been part of corrections historically. And then also noting just that corrections is in charge of one part of the spectrum. And we've talked about how like, we've seen these adverse childhood experiences and things that are happening way upstream, and corrections is on the receiving end of that. And then they have folks for a time and then send them back out into the community. But really just acknowledging the complexity and really taking a look at this from a holistic perspective is so important. And then to think about sort of updates. So this is like, now how do we actually institutionalize this moving forward? And this is an important piece because you know, the pilot part of this effort was funded and monitored by the Urban Institute. And so when we had our struggles, we had this external partner from Washington, D.C. sort of keeping us going. And now we don't. And now we're transitioning. We've learned a lot. And we've said, we really want to keep this going, but how do we do it? So this is an important phase for us. And we've talked about wanting to switch from this pilot phase to an expansion phase and really thinking about how do we do that? What are our roles? What are our commitments to each other? And how do we know we're going to go through ups and downs again? And how do we make sure we can weather them? And so we've worked together to create a scope of work, which I think might be included in your packet, that really leverages the original structure from the Urban Project into you know, a new roles document for both DOC. What is DOC committing to? What is UVM committing to? And how are we actually doing this over the next expansion phase? UVM really leading sort of the survey process and DOC really the data receiving and the innovation process. And all of this is currently like in process. We're still waiting for our no-cost contract. We'll see when that comes. We'll get there. But I just want to highlight, you want to move to the next thing, sort of in particular what UVM has done just to in this phase for how we're changing things. With the Urban Institute grant going away, we need to figure out how to actually institutionalize this at UVM. So it's not sort of a one-off project and it goes away. And so we are sort of the research core of the National Center on Restorative Justice, which is another grant that we've put in, that we've been part of for the last 5 or 6 years with the Vermont Law and Graduate School, University of San Diego, and the U.S. Office of Justice Programs. And that brings funding and resources to the university to grow the next generation of justice researchers and improve criminal justice practice and policy. And we're really going to leverage that position and platform to institutionalize PRIN at UVM. And I want to highlight 4 specific things that we've done to do that. And so the first is we want to expand these surveys. And so we have a plan to expand the PRIN surveys to all 6 prisons. And when I say surveys, I mean the survey process. So not just go in and administer the surveys, but actually co-create them again with each facility, make sure they represent the voices inside, administer the surveys, and commit to that qualitative storytelling piece as well to do the understanding of what's happening inside from those folks. We want to collaborate with Gio and Michaela, the SSCF leadership team, on this onboarding of the other facilities, because so much has been learned at Southern to actually, how does this work inside the facility? So how do we actually collaborate with them to keep this going at Southern and expand it to other facilities, leveraging sort of their mentorship for that kind of data-driven innovation. And recognizing also that we, this is going to take resources at UVM to do this. So as we think about building capacity, the last 5 years has been myself and my partner, Kathy Fox. And one of the big lessons learned is like, it's too much for 2 people. 1 facility is too much for 2 people, never mind 6. And so we're creating this new program really just to grow capacity, resource this, so that more people are involved, but really guided by the best practices of what we've learned. So we have a summer scholars program planned for launching this year, hopefully working with Gio and Michaela to do this survey collection again in Southern and expand to our next facility. So we are resourced for it. And then moving, the other thing we've done is we've institutionalized a program called the Justice Data Collaborative. And again, the other thing is, as we all sat here and looked at this, we put all our effort into creating these reports and showing up, doing it. But now we need to make sure we use the data. And that's something that really came out. So we have all of these 3 years of survey data, as well as all the qualitative data that we've collected over time. It's as a resource team here. So we have that now established at the university. And it's a great way to bring more faculty and introduce them into getting, and what does it mean to be doing prison research? All these issues expand every discipline. So more people involved, the better. And a great way to bring more students and leverage the capacity there. So we have funded a whole team of folks around collaborative statistics as well as mixed methods research to actually analyze these data. And I want to emphasize that as a resource to all of you, to corrections and to the facility, as we want people to use the data. We have a bunch of really fun projects that we're working on right now. And I just want to highlight one around a panel that we're preparing for the American Public Health Association, of which we have a bunch of different activities involved there. But that's a big source that will be there to manage not only the existing print survey, but more data as we move forward. And then we have also been able to bring in, some of these rabbit hole projects as well. And our National Center funding allows us to actually fund and partner with other related initiatives. So I'm going to highlight 3 here, but know that there's several others in the works, and they're all everything's a little connected. So it's nice to just be connected in all of these activities. But as we know that the state is expanding the peer recovery prisons, and I think you all heard from Tracy last week. But so we're working with Tracy on evaluating the impact. So great intent, but what's the implementation look like, and what can we learn from that, and how is it actually impacting the folks who are receiving the services? So there's a 3-year project that our National Center is funding to evaluate that with Tracy. We also have a project with the Department of Health around identifying data gaps. So if you actually look for information in state data systems around health and incarceration, there's just very little data out there. So how do we actually start institutionalizing this in our state data systems as well? So really trying to partner with them to look for those gaps and bring in some information there. We also, these multi-pronged approach to change, and these community partnerships that the department has been institutionalizing over the last couple of years is really of interest to our national partners. And so they're supporting a case study to look at how the intersecting compounding issues of the state is doing, the state is advancing post-secondary education access through the CCV program. We have a restorative justice network. We have all of this new peer recovery supports all happening at the same time. What is the impact of that? And so really trying to use that case study as a national model for learning of how to do this. How do we do all these things, compounding things at the state time? And we have a lot more, but I just want to highlight those because I think they're really relevant right now. And then finally, the last thing that we're doing is really trying to grow the field Again, so that there's not one or two people involved in this, but lots. With lots of great brains at the table really helping to identify and solve these challenges. So we have an event coming up on April 16th where the commissioner will be part of a panel with Tracy and the folks at Kids Apart and more local substance use disorder services at the state, really to create awareness of the issues. So we have those events. We have started developing a capacity building for more people how to do research in this way, and specifically what it means to do research in prison settings. So that it's, the folks at the department get people who are ready to go and know what it means to be a volunteer coordinator, to work with a volunteer coordinator, to work with the population, and really help grow the field that way. And then we also have this convening we're planning for the fall, which we would love everybody here to come and anyone else really around actually bringing all these projects together and grounding in conversation in data. How do we use these data to actually identify these complex compounding issues, bridge silos, and move change? So really trying to create this as sort of an annual event and sort of a community review board type resource that comes together. So just planting the seed for that. So that's the big things that UVM has been up to. Then I'm going to pass it to Isaac to talk about the big things that the Department of Corrections is doing in this space.
I know, I want to be careful of time. I know.
I think we're okay. I think we're fine. If people need, I know it's long for a break. If people need to take a personal break, please feel free to do so. Okay, I'd just like to finish this up.
Okay.
Folks can take a personal break if you need.
I know the commissioner has to head out, but very quickly, just again, really want to thank Gio, Abby, Kathy, the whole team. We're very excited about this next chapter. I think, at its core, these surveys are about transparency and by extension, accountability. That, they're public, they're very thorough, and they create these kind of conversations and hopefully guide both internal policymakers and lawmakers in our work. So we are standing up a steering committee to oversee this work as part of our strategic plan process. We're expanding the surveys. I'm excited to talk to Gio when I'm down at Southern tomorrow with Senate institutions about how we can get Michaela and Gio to really help guide this process with other facilities, because this will be new for other facilities. And they might not be as used to working with some of these external academic partners and what that might look like. I think, we heard from CCV last week, I think it was, when they talked about what it was like expanding at Southern in particular, and how much easier it was to roll out community college at Southern State. And I think that is because Southern was used to doing things a little differently because of PRIN, and PRIN has very much been that cultural catalyst. And so when we think about where can we pilot something, what facilities can I think a little bit differently and be open to welcoming community partners in, like Turning Point, like CCV, Southern, I think is that facility. And that I think is very much a legacy of Gio and Michaela and Abby and Kathy piloting for us. So yeah, very excited, I think, to think about also what the executive oversight of this work looks like in the years to come.
You did it.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Doctor. That was really interesting. I think that it's a hard question for me to ask, but a metric I'm kind of interested in is just sort of the concept of hope, How do you break the cycle of recidivism, and how are people feeling about the future?
Yeah.
Do you think you're able to sort of capture whether people are optimistic and feel like they've built sort of the skills in the facilities they need not to reoffend? Because for us, that's a metric success, right? Somebody doesn't come back.
Totally. Yeah, it's something we've spent a lot of time thinking about. And there are several measures in this survey specifically designed at that. And it's one of the things we looked at in particular around the evaluation of that honors unit that we talked about and the levels of hope and optimism for folks inside that unit versus not inside that unit, and really saw the real impact of that unit on things like hope and optimism. But as you're saying it, it's oh, what a fun conversation to have. I want to add more there, and go deeper there as well. So yeah, I think this is the idea and the opportunity for expansion is fine tune our questions so that these kinds of things are addressed from those who are using it to make change.
Thanks.
Gio, do you want to weigh in at all before we finish up?
No, I think we pretty well covered it. I just appreciate the opportunity to be here and answer any questions if you had any, but I'm not the guy that's just real talkative, so. If you had any questions, I would welcome them and take the opportunity to answer them for you, but I think we pretty well covered it.
I'd like to thank you personally for being so open down at the facility and welcoming people from the community. Gio is a volunteer coordinator there, and it's really changed the feeling in the community of having access, and you've been very welcoming to allow folks to come in and provide services there. And I want to thank you for that.
Geo's the critical link. This
Yeah.
project would have failed without Geo.
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, appreciate that, but I definitely recognize the importance. And I'm glad that we're, the position we're in with this department right now, and we're kind of being very transparent and open and welcoming assistance from other outside agencies and stuff. It's very critical. It's been very critical.
That's great. Thank you. So we have a question, John?
And it's more of a statement, just being new to this, Gio, because this
Yeah.
is there's a bunch of us here that are new to the committee.
Yes.
This presentation was one of the most helpful for me personally to hear about what's going on. And it's thank you for helping make that all happen.
Yeah, I mean, a big shout out goes to UVM. They really did a good job of capturing the data that we were trying to gather. So, yeah, I think it was well put together very well.
Gio? Agree. Anything else before we take a break? Thank you, Abby.
Thank you.
Gio,
very much.
Gio, you're lucky you don't have to drive. It's snowing up here. I'm sure it's snowing down there. But thank you all. And if you're driving today, be careful because it just started. Ugh, it's nasty out there. So let's go off of YouTube. We'll take a break and come back.